In a world where power defines worth, where expensive suits and polished shoes walk over those deemed invisible, one woman dared to step into the shadows, watching, waiting, enduring. Liana Covington was never supposed to be anything more than the cleaning staff. At least, that's what they thought. A black woman in a corporate empire built by old money and privilege. She knew exactly what it meant to be underestimated. She had grown up surrounded by wealth, yet she had seen firsthand how those in power treated the ones they deemed beneath them. So when the whispers started, stories of abuse, humiliation, and unchecked arrogance within Covington Enterprises, she made a choice. She stripped away her last name, her influence, her identity. She became a nobody, a janitor, a test they never saw coming. Inside those gleaming office walls, she was met with sneers instead of greetings, commands instead of conversations. They mocked her, ordered her around, pushed her to the brink, never realizing she was the one holding all the power. The managers laughed as they made her scrub floors on her hands and knees. The executives watched as she was forced to pick up after them like a servant. The entire company turned a blind eye as she was humiliated, degraded, erased. But every cruel word, every smug smirk, every moment of condescension was another piece of evidence. And when the truth finally came out, the ones who thought they ruled this empire learned the hardest lesson of their lives. How far would you go to uncover the truth? How does power truly work when the masks come off? Let me know where you're watching from and what you think of Liana's plan in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the moment everything changes. The moment Liana Covington stepped through the grand glass doors of Covington Enterprises, she felt it, the weight of judgment pressing against her like an unshakable force. Dressed in the standard janitorial uniform, a navy blue shirt, black pants, and plain white sneakers, she looked nothing like the privileged daughter of Nathaniel Covington, the man whose name was etched in gold letters at the entrance. That was exactly the point. Today, she was not Liana Covington, the heiress to a multi-million-dollar empire. She was just another cleaner, a nobody. The reception area was bustling with early morning energy. Executives in tailored suits strode confidently across the marble floors. Assistants scurried with coffee orders, and interns clutched their tablets like lifelines. No one paid her much attention, except for a select few. As she made her way past the front desk, she caught the sneering glance of Trevor Langley, the company's senior operations manager. He leaned against the counter, his polished shoes tapping idly against the floor. "New hire?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. His gaze flicked to her ID badge before he scoffed. "Make sure you don't slack off. We don't pay people to take their time admiring the decor." Liana met his gaze evenly, suppressing the urge to respond. Instead, she nodded and continued toward the janitor's supply closet, her hands tightening into fists. She had anticipated hostility, but experiencing it firsthand was different. She wasn't here to argue. She was here to observe, to understand what truly happened in her father's company when no one knew she was watching. Her first assignment was simple: clean the executive floor's restrooms. A task meant to be rotated among the cleaning staff, yet somehow Diane Mercer, the supervisor, had decided it would be hers alone. "You got a problem with that?" Diane's tone was clipped, her eyes scrutinizing Liana as if daring her to complain. "Because if you do, the door is right there." Liana shook her head. "No problem." The bathroom was spotless when she entered, but she knew better. The cycle would repeat itself soon. Higher-ups walking in, leaving a mess, expecting someone like her to erase all traces of their presence. And sure enough, not even 10 minutes later, the door swung open, and a pair of stiletto heels clicked against the tiled floor. Rita Holloway, a senior marketing executive, entered, barely acknowledging Liana as she touched up her lipstick in the mirror. A moment later, she tossed the tissue she had used onto the pristine counter. It landed just inches from the trash bin. Liana exhaled slowly, gripping the rag in her hand. She picked up the discarded tissue, feeling Rita's amused gaze on her. "Didn't know we had new staff," Rita mused, capping her lipstick. "Hope you last longer than the last one. Some of them just can't handle the pressure." Liana gave a tight smile. "I'll manage." Rita smirked. Good luck with that. By noon, her back ached from scrubbing floors, wiping windows, and hauling cleaning supplies up and down the building. Yet the physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the mental strain. She had heard whispers, subtle but cutting, every time she passed by groups of employees. Isn't she a little too clean-cut for a janitor? Maybe she thinks she's special. She'll quit by the end of the week, guaranteed. She stored her supplies in the maintenance closet and took a moment to breathe. She had only been here a few hours, but she had seen enough. Enough arrogance, enough entitlement, enough cruelty hidden beneath polished smiles and expensive suits. But this was only the beginning. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Liana's first day had been rough, but the following days proved to be far worse. The moment she stepped into the building each morning, it was as if an unspoken rule had been established. She was nothing more than an invisible servant, existing only to clean up after others. Trevor Langley made it his personal mission to ensure she never had a moment's rest. He would deliberately walk into freshly cleaned rooms, carelessly spilling coffee or scattering papers across the floor, then call her back with a smirk. "Missed a spot," he'd say, arms crossed, watching as she kneeled to clean up his mess. The satisfaction in his voice was unmistakable. He wasn't just assigning her work, he was making sure she felt beneath him. Diane Mercer, equally eager to assert her dominance, took a different approach. Under the guise of training, she doubled Liana's workload while mysteriously lightening the schedules of the other janitors. "You don't mind, do you?" Diane's tone was laced with mock sweetness, but her eyes held nothing but cruelty. "I figured since you're new, you'd want to prove yourself." Refusing wasn't an option. Every time Liana so much as hesitated, Diane's expression would shift, daring her to complain. The break room offered no refuge. The moment Liana walked in, conversations would stop, followed by hushed whispers and muffled laughter. One afternoon, she overheard Rita Holloway speaking to another executive, her voice dripping with amusement. "That new cleaner, she's got this air about her, like she thinks she's above all this. Maybe she should be reminded of her place." Liana tightened her grip around the rag in her hands but said nothing. She wasn't here to fight. She was here to learn, even if every lesson was laced with humiliation. One of the worst moments came when she was assigned to clean the boardroom right after an executive meeting. As she wiped down the polished mahogany table, Diane walked in, arms folded, an all-too-familiar smirk curling at her lips. "Make sure you get every corner," she said. Then, without breaking eye contact, she knocked over a full glass of water onto the floor. The liquid spilled across the carpet, soaking into the fibers. "Oops," Diane murmured, feigning surprise. "Clean that up, will you?" Liana's jaw clenched, but she nodded, kneeling to soak up the mess. Diane didn't move. She stood there, watching, reveling in the control she had over her. By the end of her shift, exhaustion settled deep in Liana's bones. But the worst part wasn't the physical labor. It was the slow, creeping realization that no matter what she did, it would never be enough. She wasn't just expected to clean. She was expected to be small, to be insignificant, to endure every slight and every humiliation without complaint. Sitting alone in the storage room, she stared at her calloused hands. The higher-ups at Covington Enterprises didn't just look down on janitorial staff. They relished in their ability to make them feel less than human. And for now, all she could do was endure. Liana's exhaustion deepened with each passing day. Every morning, she arrived to find new tasks waiting for her. Tasks that should have been distributed among the janitorial staff, but somehow always landed on her alone. Diane Mercer ensured it. Whenever Liana completed a job, Diane would find something wrong, forcing her to redo it under the pretense of maintaining high standards. Trevor Langley, on the other hand, had turned her presence into a personal amusement. He began making a game out of testing her patience. He would summon her to his office for pointless tasks, wiping an already spotless desk, rearranging files he'd just thrown out of order, only to criticize her for being too slow. "You really aren't cut out for this, are you?" he mused one afternoon, leaning against his chair as she swept the floor for the second time that day. "But don't worry, you'll learn. Or you won't, and we'll find someone who actually knows how to work." The break room, which had once been a quiet place for her to breathe, had become yet another battleground. Whenever she entered, conversations would die down, replaced by knowing glances and muffled chuckles. One afternoon, she found a half-eaten sandwich deliberately smashed onto the floor, its contents smeared across the tiles. A note sat beside it, written in a deliberately childish scrawl. Missed a spot. She threw it away in silence. Rita Holloway was just as relentless. Unlike Trevor and Diane, she didn't need to order Liana around. Her power came from words. "You poor thing," Rita cooed one afternoon, stopping her in the hallway. "Working so hard. But I have to wonder, what's keeping you here? You don't seem comfortable. Maybe this isn't the place for you." The implication was clear. Quit. Leave. Accept that you don't belong. But quitting was not an option. One evening, after finishing her shift, she returned to the janitorial closet to find her belongings missing. Her bag, her phone, even the jacket she had brought with her in the morning, gone. She searched every corner of the storage room, only to hear laughter echoing from down the hall. She turned to see Trevor and another executive walking past, speaking just loud enough for her to hear. "I swear, some people don't appreciate what they have," Trevor chuckled. "They should be grateful we even let them stay." Her stomach twisted, but she said nothing. She knew exactly what this was, another reminder of how powerless she was. By the end of the week, she was beyond exhausted. Every muscle ached, her hands were raw from scrubbing, and her mind was drowning in the weight of constant humiliation. Yet, she still refused to break. She had come to learn the truth, and now she knew it. These people didn't just mistreat their workers, they enjoyed it. They thrived on it. Liana had thought she had reached the limit of their cruelty, but she was wrong. The abuse she had endured before, petty insults, unfair workloads, veiled threats, was nothing compared to what came next. The people around her no longer bothered with subtlety. They wanted her to feel small. They wanted her to know she was beneath them. Diane Mercer, who had already made it her mission to break Liana's spirit, escalated her torment. One morning, she pulled Liana aside just as she finished wiping down the elevator doors. "Lobby floors," Diane said, tossing a scrub brush into Liana's hands. "I want them spotless." Liana glanced at the cleaning machines parked nearby, confused. "I thought maintenance used the buffer for the marble." Diane smiled, slow and satisfied. "Yes, but I don't trust machines. I trust effort. I want you to do it by hand, on your knees." A hush fell over the nearby employees as the words registered. Several paused in their conversations, watching with barely concealed amusement. Liana's hands tightened around the scrub brush, but she forced herself to nod. Without another word, she lowered herself to the floor and began scrubbing. The marble was cool against her skin as she dragged the brush in slow, methodical circles. The bristles scraped against the polished surface, but she knew it was pointless. No matter how hard she worked, Diane would find something wrong. Liana felt eyes on her the entire time. Executives walking past, pretending not to see, assistants whispering behind their hands, security guards smirking as they leaned against the walls. A pair of designer heels stopped inches from her face. "Oh my God," a familiar voice drawled. "Rita Holloway. Is this really necessary, Diane? Poor thing looks pathetic." Liana didn't look up, but she heard Diane's amused reply. "Discipline builds character." The two women laughed and walked off, their voices fading into the hum of the lobby. Trevor Langley, not to be outdone, found his own way to exploit Liana's forced obedience. He had long since stopped pretending she was a regular employee. Now, he treated her like entertainment. He called her into rooms she had just cleaned, claiming she had missed a spot. He spilled water on conference tables and watched as she wiped it up, arms crossed, a lazy smirk on his face. But the worst came when he decided to put on a show. One afternoon, Liana was restocking the paper towels in the staff lounge when Trevor strolled in, holding a fresh cup of coffee. A handful of employees sat at the tables, chatting over lunch. Liana kept her head down and continued working. She didn't see Trevor's smirk until it was too late. "Oh no," he gasped dramatically, and before she could react, His hand tipped forward, spilling dark liquid across the pristine tile floor. Silence filled the room for a split second before Trevor let out a fake sigh. What a mess. He turned to Liana, still holding the empty cup. Good thing we have someone for that. Liana felt her stomach drop. A slow wave of laughter spread through the lounge. Some of the employees covered their mouths, pretending to be shocked. Others made no effort to hide their amusement. Liana forced herself to move, retrieving a rag from her cart. As she crouched down, the laughter grew louder. Make sure you get every drop, Trevor added, standing over her, sipping from a second cup he had in his other hand. We wouldn't want the floor to be sticky. A woman at the nearest table giggled. She should use her hair to dry it up. It'd probably work better. Tears burned the edges of Liana's vision, but she blinked them away. She wasn't going to let them see her break. She scrubbed the floor in silence, the heat of humiliation crawling up her neck. She could feel their eyes on her, feel the smugness radiating from Trevor as he loomed above her like a king watching his servant grovel. When she finally stood, Trevor tilted his head. He gestured to a single dark spot that hadn't fully dried. Missed a spot. Liana gritted her teeth and bent down again. More laughter. When she finished, Trevor stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. You're getting better at this. His smirk widened. I think you've finally found your place. Liana said nothing. She wheeled her cart out of the lounge, her hands shaking against the handle. That night, alone in the storage room, she allowed herself a single deep breath. She had come here to understand the truth. Now she knew it. These people didn't just think they were superior. They needed to prove it. Liana had thought she had endured the worst of their cruelty, but she was wrong. The abuse didn't just continue, it evolved. It became more deliberate, more precise. They were no longer satisfied with making her work harder than the others. Now, they wanted to see her break. Diane Mercer had perfected the art of humiliation. One morning, just as employees were filing into the building, she stopped Liana in the executive hallway, her voice loud enough to draw attention. We're out of air fresheners, Diane said, pointing lazily toward the janitorial closet. Go get one. Liana turned toward the closet, but before she could take a step, Diane added, Oh, and while you're at it, get down and crawl under the desks. Some people have been complaining about dust. Liana's breath caught. A ripple of amusement passed through the hallway. A few executives slowed their steps, pretending to check their phones, but clearly listening. A younger assistant covered her mouth, hiding a smirk. Diane crossed her arms, tilting her head. Is there a problem? Liana's skin burned with the weight of their stares. She knew exactly what Diane wanted, to see her hesitate, to see the flicker of shame cross her face. It would give Diane power, would feed her belief that Liana was beneath them all. No problem, Liana forced out, keeping her voice steady. She lowered herself to the floor, the cold tile pressing against her palms as she crawled under the heavy mahogany desks. She heard the faint shuffle of shoes, the rustle of fabric as people turned to whisper. God, I'd rather quit than do that. She should be grateful. At least she has a job. Can you imagine? She kept her focus on the task, her muscles stiff as she wiped along the baseboards, ignoring the laughter that followed her movements. She knew she could have refused, could have walked away, but that wasn't why she was here. She was here to endure, to see just how far they would go. When she finished, she stood, brushing dust from her uniform. Diane gave a slow, appraising look before smirking. Not bad, but next time, make sure you really get into the corners. Liana nodded, silent. Trevor Langley was waiting for her the moment she stepped out of the hallway. He had his usual smug expression, leaning lazily against the doorframe of his office. Got a minute? She didn't, but she nodded anyway. Inside his desk was a disaster, papers scattered, a half-eaten sandwich sitting on top of a crumpled report, coffee rings staining the wooden surface. He made a show of sighing and shaking his head. I need this cleaned up. Liana moved toward the desk, reaching for a rag, but his voice stopped her. Trevor leaned back in his chair, smirking. Use a rag if you want, but no hands. Mouth only. A thick silence filled the room. Liana could hear the distant hum of the air conditioning, the faint voices of employees in the hallway. This wasn't about cleaning. This was about control, about pushing her so far that she would finally crack. She could see it in his eyes, the anticipation, the amusement. He was waiting for her to snap, to refuse, to give him an excuse to get rid of her. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. Slowly, she bent down, picked up the rag with her elbows, and pushed it across the desk. Trevor let out a short chuckle. Clever. She finished without a word. When she left his office, she walked past Rita Holloway in the hallway. Rita barely looked up from her phone, but her lips curled into a knowing smirk. "Took you long enough," she murmured. Liana ignored her and kept walking. Liana no longer expected kindness. Every morning, she stepped into the building knowing that whatever dignity she had left would be stripped away. The routine was cruel and relentless. Diane's degrading orders, Trevor's sadistic power plays, Rita's sharp words disguised as casual observations. But now, something had changed. They were no longer content with humiliating her. They wanted to make her disappear. Diane made the first move. Isolation was its own form of punishment, and she wielded it mercilessly. At first, Liana thought she was imagining things. The way conversations would stop the second she walked into a room. The way people who once nodded in polite acknowledgement now acted as if she didn't exist. But then she overheard two janitors whispering near the lockers while she restocked supplies. "She's different," one of them muttered. "She doesn't belong with us." The other scoffed. "She's trouble. The supervisors are watching her. Best to stay out of it." Their voices faded as they walked away, leaving Liana gripping the mop handle, her stomach twisting. She wasn't imagining it. Diane had poisoned them against her. It wasn't just the silent treatment. Her workload, already exhausting, became impossible. Diane reassigned her to the most isolated parts of the building: storage rooms, maintenance corridors, abandoned office spaces. These were areas no one visited, places where no one would hear her if she needed help. When she hesitated upon receiving the new schedule, Diane only smiled. Some people work better alone. There was no room for argument. Trevor, never one to let Diane have all the fun, took things further. He began changing her shifts at the last minute, ensuring that whenever she arrived at a location, the other janitors had already finished and left. She spent hours scrubbing floors no one walked on, dusting desks covered in layers of undisturbed grime, pushing a mop through hallways where only the hum of flickering fluorescent lights kept her company. Even the security guards seemed to vanish when she was working late. One evening, after a grueling 12-hour shift in a basement storage area, she trudged back to the janitorial closet, exhausted and aching. The hallway was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made her skin crawl. She reached for the door handle, locked. She frowned. She had left it open. She patted her pockets, searching for her key. Nothing. Her bag, her phone, her jacket, everything was inside. She knocked, then knocked again. No response. A slow, mocking clap echoed from the end of the hall. She turned to see Trevor approaching with two executives, their expression smug. "Oh no," Trevor drawled, voice dripping with false sympathy. "Locked out? That's unfortunate." The executives chuckled, shaking their heads, as if they were watching a child make a foolish mistake. "Maybe she should just sleep here," one of them joked. Liana's pulse pounded in her ears. Trevor leaned against the wall, examining his nails. "You know," he mused, "a smart person would have kept her key safe. But maybe you're just not cut out for this job." His tone was light, almost playful, but there was nothing casual about the way he watched her, waiting for a reaction. Liana forced her expression to remain neutral. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Trevor sighed dramatically. "Well, good luck with that." He turned to leave, the others following, their laughter fading as they disappeared around the corner. Liana barely slept that night. She sat curled up against the cold wall outside the janitor's closet, her arms wrapped around her knees to preserve what little warmth she could. The building was silent, eerily empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being completely alone, yet utterly exposed. Her muscles ached. Her hands were raw from hours of scrubbing, and exhaustion pressed down on her like a heavy weight. but she forced herself to stay awake. She knew that if she let her guard down, something worse could happen. This place thrived on weakness. By the time morning came, her body felt hollow, as if someone had drained her of all energy. She heard footsteps approaching, then the sound of keys jingling. A security guard arrived, unlocking the door with a blank expression. He didn't ask why she was there. He didn't even acknowledge her existence. Without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, staring at the now open supply closet. She stepped inside, retrieved her belongings, and tried to ignore the way her hands trembled as she buttoned her uniform. The exhaustion was bone deep, but there was no time to recover. She had a shift to start. When she reached the cleaning station, Diane Mercer was already there, leaning against a desk with a coffee in hand. The moment she saw Liana's disheveled state, a slow smile spread across her lips. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice filled with mock sympathy. Liana didn't answer. Diane chuckled and tossed a mop toward her. "I hope you're not too tired. The conference rooms need to be spotless before the morning meetings. And don't forget, elbow grease, not laziness." Liana caught the mop and turned away before Diane could see the flicker of anger behind her tired eyes. The morning passed in a haze of scrubbing, mopping, and wiping down glass surfaces that were already clean. The exhaustion slowed her movements, but she refused to stop. She knew the moment she showed weakness, they would pounce. Trevor Langley, still riding the high of locking her out the night before, wasn't finished tormenting her. While she was on her knees, wiping the floor outside his office, he casually strolled by and accidentally bumped into her. The impact was just enough to throw her off balance, her hands pressing against the wet tiles to keep from falling completely. Trevor let out a low chuckle. "Watch where you're going," he said, smirking down at her before stepping over her, as if she were nothing more than an obstacle in his way. The executives standing nearby laughed under their breath, shaking their heads in amusement. Liana clenched her jaw and resumed scrubbing. But the worst moment came during the weekly company luncheon. Every Friday, the executive team gathered in the large dining hall for an exclusive, catered meal. It was a tradition, a reward for those at the top. Liana had been assigned to clean the room while they ate, ensuring their tables remained spotless even as they continued to make a mess. The smell of roasted meat and freshly baked bread filled the air, her stomach twisting painfully from hunger. She hadn't eaten since the morning, but she pushed the thought away. She had work to do. Trevor saw his opportunity. Seated at the center of the room, surrounded by his usual group of executives, he picked up his fork, still covered in sauce, and let it slip from his fingers onto the freshly mopped floor. The sound of metal against tile was deafening in the sudden silence. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned toward her. Liana froze, staring at the fork as if it were something foreign, something she wasn't sure she had the strength to pick up. Trevor leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms behind his head. "Oops," he said, voice casual, but the amusement in his eyes was unmistakable. "Someone should take care of that." Liana's throat tightened. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the room pressing against her. Slowly, she bent down, gripping the fork with her gloved fingers. The humiliation burned through her skin, making her cheeks feel hot, her pulse pounding in her ears. Trevor smirked. "Good girl." Laughter erupted around the room. Rita Holloway, seated a few tables away, let out a dramatic sigh, shaking her head. "It's honestly inspiring," she mused, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some people just know their place." Liana swallowed the bile rising in her throat. Every part of her wanted to stand up, to throw the fork across the room, to scream at them, to do something, anything. But she couldn't. She finished cleaning in silence, each chuckle and whisper slicing into her like a blade. Liana walked into the building just like she had every morning for the past several weeks, her uniform pressed, her expression blank, her steps steady. On the surface, nothing seemed different. Her body still ached from the relentless labor. Her hands still bore the raw sting of cleaning chemicals, and exhaustion still clung to her bones. But today, something had shifted. The weight of humiliation from the previous day had settled in her chest, but instead of crushing her, it had sharpened her focus. They thought they had broken her, thought they had reduced her to nothing, thought she was too weak to resist. But they had no idea who she really was. She made her way to the janitorial station, where Diane Mercer, as expected, was already waiting. Diane leaned against the counter, sipping coffee with a smirk that widened the moment she saw Liana. "I hope you're not too sore from yesterday," she said, her tone filled with mockery. "We've got a long day ahead, and I expect you to move faster this time. The executive lounge needs to be spotless before the afternoon meetings. And I don't want to hear a single complaint." Liana nodded as she always did, keeping her expression carefully neutral, her hands steady as she picked up the mop. Diane didn't notice anything different. Trevor Langley did. He was waiting in the hallway, like he always was, standing just at the edge of her path, forcing her to either stop or sidestep around him. This time, she stopped. He studied her for a second, his smirk lazy but curious, as if something about her was slightly off, though he couldn't quite place it. "Still standing," he mused, tilting his head. "I have to say, I'm impressed. Most people would have quit by now." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough that only she could hear. "But then again, I guess some people don't have anywhere else to go." For the first time, Liana met his gaze directly. "You're right," she said calmly. Trevor blinked. She had never answered before, never spoken unless it was to meekly acknowledge an order. His smirk faltered for half a second, but he quickly covered it up with a chuckle. "Good. I'd hate for you to get any ideas." Liana walked away before he could say anything else. The day passed in its usual pattern. Endless cleaning, endless orders, endless glances from executives who saw her as nothing more than part of the background. But she wasn't just working today. She was watching, listening, memorizing every cruel smirk, every condescending remark, every abuse of power. Then the announcement came. At exactly 4 p.m., a voice echoed through the hallways. "All employees report to the main conference room immediately. This is a mandatory meeting." A wave of murmurs rippled through the building. Meetings at this time were rare, and the tone of the announcement carried an unfamiliar weight. Liana kept cleaning as if she hadn't heard, though her heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't nervous. She was ready. Executives, managers, and assistants funneled into the massive conference hall, their conversations filled with speculation. Trevor and Diane were among the last to arrive, both looking annoyed at being pulled from their daily routines. Then the door opened again, and the room fell silent. Nathaniel Covington, CEO of Covington Enterprises, entered with slow, deliberate steps, his expression unreadable. Dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, he exuded the same commanding presence that had built the company from the ground up. Executives straightened in their seats, some whispering to one another, trying to predict the reason behind the sudden meeting. Diane was the first to recover, forcing a polite smile as she stepped forward. "Mr. Covington, sir, what's this about?" "We weren't informed of any. I wasn't asking," Nathaniel said smoothly, cutting her off. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made the entire room stiffen. Diane's mouth snapped shut instantly. Liana remained near the back of the room, gripping the mop handle, her heart steady. Nathaniel let the silence linger before he spoke again. "For weeks, there has been an internal investigation into workplace ethics and employee treatment within this company." The room shifted. Nervous glances passed between executives. Trevor's smirk wavered. Diane's fingers tightened around her clipboard. Rita Holloway, seated near the front, finally looked up from her phone. Nathaniel continued. "It has come to my attention that certain individuals in positions of power have not only failed to uphold the standards of this company, but have actively fostered a toxic, hostile work environment." The murmurs grew louder. Diane let out a small chuckle, though it sounded forced. "Sir, if there's been a misunderstanding, there is no misunderstanding," Nathaniel interrupted. "The findings are clear. The evidence is undeniable." Trevor frowned, sitting forward. "What evidence?" he demanded, his voice carrying an edge of unease. Nathaniel turned his head slightly, and then for the first time, his eyes landed on Liana. "Come here," he said. The room shifted again, heads turning toward the woman who had, until now, been invisible. Liana released the mop handle, and then she walked forward. Each step was deliberate, heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. Diane's brow furrowed. "Why is the janitor?" "She is not a janitor," Nathaniel said sharply. "She is Liana Covington." A stunned silence crashed over the room like a wave. Liana stopped beside her father, standing tall. Trevor's smirk disappeared completely. Diane's face drained of color. Rita's lips parted slightly in disbelief. Nathaniel let the moment hang before speaking again. "Liana has spent the past several weeks undercover within this company, documenting everything that has taken place. And what she found was disgraceful." Liana turned toward Diane first. "You forced me to crawl under desks in front of employees just to humiliate me." Diane opened her mouth, but no words came out. Liana's eyes then landed on Trevor. "You locked me out of the supply closet overnight, knowing I had nowhere to go. You shoved me while I was working. You threw food on the ground just to see me pick it up." Trevor's jaw tightened, his face darkening. She turned toward Rita last. "And you," Liana's voice remained steady. "You encouraged all of it." Nathaniel exhaled slowly. "Distribute the termination notices." Diane's head snapped up. "What?" "You heard me," Nathaniel said, his voice ice cold. "Effective immediately. All employees found guilty of misconduct are terminated. Security will escort you out." Trevor shot to his feet. "You can't be serious." Nathaniel didn't even blink. "You have 10 minutes to clear out your office." Diane's lips trembled. "Sir, please, this is not a discussion." Nathaniel cut her off. "You preyed on someone you believed to be powerless. And now you are powerless." Security wasted no time escorting Trevor, Diane, and Rita out of the conference room. Diane's protests were shrill, her voice cracking as she tried to argue her way out. "Mr. Covington, please. I was only enforcing company standards." Nathaniel didn't even glance at her. Trevor, still in shock, yanked his arm away from the guard, gripping his sleeve. "You can't do this," he spat, his face red with anger. "I built this department. You think you can replace me overnight?" Nathaniel's expression remained unreadable. "I think you overestimate your importance." Rita, ever the opportunist, tried a different approach. She smoothed down her blouse, forcing a shaky smile. "Mr. Covington, let's be reasonable. I wasn't involved. I may have laughed once or twice, but that's hardly." Nathaniel raised a hand, silencing her. "You stood by and did nothing. That's just as damning." Her face fell as security ushered her toward the exit. Liana stood still, watching as the people who had tormented her for weeks were removed one by one. The weight pressing on her chest for so long finally lifted, but there was no satisfaction in seeing them panic. No joy in their downfall. Only justice. The remaining employees shifted uneasily in their seats, glancing at one another. They had laughed, whispered, turned a blind eye. They weren't innocent. Nathaniel turned to them, his gaze sharp. "This company will not tolerate abuse of power, and I suggest you all take a long look at yourselves before assuming you are safe." The warning was clear. Trevor, Diane, and Rita walked out of the building, their steps unsteady, their expressions filled with disbelief. Just hours ago, they had strutted through these hallways with absolute confidence, believing themselves untouchable. Now everything they had built, their careers, their reputations, their influence, had crumbled in an instant. Outside, the whispers spread like wildfire. Employees exchanging hushed conversations as they watched the once powerful figures reduced to nothing. No one reached out to help them. No one tried to defend them. The people they had once controlled, once belittled, now stood in quiet judgment, their eyes following their disgraced exits with thinly veiled satisfaction. Diane clutched her phone in desperation, frantically trying to make calls, her hands trembling as she dialed. One after another, the calls went unanswered. She tried again, her breath coming faster, but there was no one left willing to listen. She turned to Trevor, hoping for some reassurance, but he wasn't even looking at her. His usual smug demeanor was gone, replaced with rigid anger, barely held beneath the surface. He refused to meet anyone's gaze, his jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides. He walked faster, as if increasing his pace could somehow undo what had happened, as if outrunning the truth would make it disappear. But there was no escaping this. The reality had already settled, a suffocating weight pressing down on them, reminding them that they were no longer the ones in control. Rita held onto her handbag so tightly her knuckles turned white, her usual air of superiority completely stripped away. She tried to walk with the same confidence she always carried, her chin lifted, her back straight, but the cracks in her composure were obvious. She knew the truth just as much as the others. There was no salvaging this. They had been cast out, discarded like the very people they had mocked for years. Inside the conference room, the air was thick with tension. Employees sat frozen in their seats, afraid to move, afraid to speak. The reality of what had just happened settled heavily upon them, and the weight of their own complicity became undeniable. They had watched Liana suffer. They had laughed, they had whispered, they had stood by and done nothing while she was humiliated. And now, as Nathaniel Covington looked out at them, his sharp gaze slicing through the silence, they understood that their inaction had not gone unnoticed. He folded his hands in front of him, his voice calm, but carrying the kind of authority that left no room for argument. "This isn't just about the three who were fired," he said, his words deliberate, his tone measured but firm. "Many of you sat in this room and allowed it to happen. Some of you encouraged it. Some of you turned a blind eye. Some of you assumed it wasn't your problem. Silence is a choice, and choices have consequences." His words hung in the air like a heavy storm, impossible to ignore, impossible to deflect. Several employees swallowed hard, their eyes darting away, their bodies rigid in their seats. No one dared to protest. No one dared to pretend they were innocent. The guilt sat in the room like an unspoken force, pressing against them all. Liana stood beside her father, her presence commanding in a way none of them had ever recognized before. She had once been invisible to them, just another worker they could dismiss, another person beneath their notice. Now, she was the only person in the room who truly mattered. She had spent weeks enduring their cruelty, had listened to their taunts, had been forced to kneel and scrub floors while they watched and laughed. But she had never been powerless. They just hadn't known who they were dealing with. Nathaniel turned to her, his expression softer but no less serious. "From now on, you will oversee a full evaluation of our company's policies. Every department, every manager, every employee. If they do not meet the standards of this company, your decision is final." The weight of his words sent another wave of tension through the room. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had never feared Liana before. Now, their futures rested in her hands. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. They had tried to erase her, to make her small, to force her into submission. But in the end, it was they who had been erased. She met their eyes one by one, watching them lower their gazes, watching the shame settle into their shoulders. They weren't sorry for what they had done. They were only sorry they had been caught. As the meeting adjourned, Nathaniel left first, his presence lingering even after he stepped out of the room. The employees hesitated before standing, glancing at Liana as if waiting for some final word, some indication of what came next. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She had already won. As she turned and walked out, she felt something shift inside her, something settle. The burden she had carried for weeks was gone. She had endured. She had waited. And now she had prevailed. The end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. What did you think of Liana's reveal? Did justice get served the way you expected? Let me know your favorite moment in the comments. Also, where are you watching from? Drop your country or city below.